January, it's Martin Luther King Day. It's 2022. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Anthony Davis Show. I'm here in Los Angeles, California. Carla is producing the show from London, England. And between us, we're going to do our best to keep you in the loop of what's happening across the United States today, because Backchannel really is the only place you can listen to, watch, and chat with hosts of live shows right here on your device. If you'd like to do that, just wake your device up, then say, and then your message. And that's how you kind of get through to us. You can also follow us on YouTube because we're live streaming there. And you are welcome to go to backchannel.tv and get involved in the web chat. We're going to discuss today the pioneering U.S. military fighter pilot, Charles McKee. He's died at the age of 102. Also looking at his life and discovering how he was one of the last living members of the Tuskegee Airmen, an all-African-American military pilot group who fought during World War II. We'll be talking about voting rights, of course, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, its origins, and ask, what would Martin Luther King make of the current situation? And we'll be celebrating the African-American women of the civil rights movement too, often unsung heroes. So that's all to come here on Backchannel. And if you would like to be involved at any point, then just join in the usual way. You can write reviews for us at backchannel.tv, and you can also give pointers and suggestions for where you would like this show to go. Don't say in the trash. Times Union this morning is the first newspaper that we're going to review, because we do this. We zigzag across the United States and we check out some of the local newspapers that are making interesting headlines. The Times Union is from Albany, New York. Costs just $2. But you can have it today for free with us. Grizzly discovered at funeral home is their headline. Yes, authorities said they made a gruesome discovery at Johnstown Funeral Home last week after its owner was accused of dodging family members seeking an update about cremation services for a deceased relative. Officials discovered an unspecified number of decomposing human remains at the Ellie Barnett Funeral Home and at least 2 bodies in the garage where the remains were stored alongside trash and furniture. Terrifying. Family helpers seek support. This is at-home caregivers struggling to make ends meet. Push for new legislation. And activist remembered after November killings. This is Scott Myers, an engineer, poet, singer, gardener, techie, activist, and perennial thorn in the side of Greene County's leaders. Was killed just after midnight on November 26th in his home. Police arrested Carrie Weiser, an acquaintance, charging her with second-degree murder. The 68-year-old was described by those who loved him as strikingly intelligent, a jack of all trades, who worked for Boeing, who could rewire a house, program computers, and write beautiful poetry. So he fought against corruption and offered compassion, and then the activist found himself dead. You know, I do fear, I've said this before, but I do fear that going forward, public activists, people who make themselves known and are out there trying to, do good and stand up against authoritarian rule, will eventually, be on the wrong side of history. I think that more and more people are kind of taking it upon themselves to police against these people. It's worrying, but I think that often the people that don't have respect for these types of activists are also the ones who have the weapons. Okay, next, the Napa Valley Register from Auburn, New York. This leads with council to vote on cannabis. What, they're going to be smoking cannabis while they vote? That sounds like a great idea. It says an ordinance amendment allowing adult use retail cannabis sales in Napa is headed toward the final step of Napa City Council approval on Tuesday evening. Napa currently only permits medical sales of cannabis, which means customers are required to have a physician-approved medical card to purchase cannabis products. Under adult use retail rules, anyone aged 21 or older can purchase cannabis products by showing identification. California legalized recreational cannabis in 2016 after 57% of voters and 61% of voters in Napa County voted to approve Proposition 64. But most California cities, like Napa, still don't allow adult use cannabis sales. Not where I live. Where I live, it is rife. I mean, you can just smell it in the air. Everybody's smoking. And, I I kind of think it's rather wonderful, to be honest. It just makes people a little less on edge, and that can only be a good thing. WHO delivers 1 billion vaccine doses. The World Health Organization said on Sunday the UN-backed program shipping coronavirus vaccines to many poor countries has now delivered 1 billion doses. But that milestone is only a reminder of the work that remains after hoarding and stockpiling in rich countries. Yeah, this has really been their beef, hasn't it? That why are countries like America administering a third dose when the poorest countries haven't even had a first dose? And this is why they've set up this COVAX kind of unified delivery mechanism. Anyway, I'm pleased to see. It says a shipment of 1.1 million COVID-19 vaccine doses to Rwanda on Saturday included the billionth dose supplied via the COVAX program. WHO has long criticized unequal distribution of vaccines and calls for manufacturers and other countries to prioritize COVAX. It said that as of Thursday, 36 of its 194 member countries had vaccinated less than 10% of their population, and 88 had vaccinated less than 40%. So there we go. And still, the vaccine here in America, even though about 68%, 68% of Americans are fully vaccinated, there's still huge negative propaganda being put out there. I played that clip from Marjorie Taylor Greene the other day. Do you remember that? It was her saying that it was a bioweapon. Do you remember that? Yeah. She said this just a few days ago online. There's a video of her talking about it, that it's a bioweapon and it's designed to wipe out a whole generation. And I was like, wow, really? You're a congresswoman and this is your rhetoric? So that's kind of what we're up against. People who are still listening to the likes of Marjorie Taylor Greene and think that what she says is true, when everybody who is of sound mind knows that she just has lost it. Freddie, good morning. Thank you for joining us from Louisiana this morning. Nice to know that you're part of Backchannel. You can get in touch in the same way. You can go to backchannel.tv and you can chat with us there. No Room for the Table. This is a volunteer-based non-profit organization that's fed hungry Napa residents 5 days a week over 3 decades, is still looking for a new home. The organization was asked to vacate Napa's first Presbyterian church, where it was founded and resided for 34 years after a financial dispute with the church last year. And since leaving the church in August, the Table Board has come close to finding new location twice. Both deals eventually fell through, but the board has resumed its push to find a new dining room and kitchen this year. And finally, new treatment for cancer patients. For many cancer patients, losing their hair as a result of chemotherapy is a very unwelcome and regular reminder of the disease they're fighting. Nathan Scott Lambert agrees. He underwent chemotherapy at Providence Queen of the Valley Medical Center. He didn't go bald. That's because he made use of a new head cooling system that works to minimize hair loss from chemotherapy. It's called the Dignicap Scalp Cooling System, and it's now available at the Napa Hospital. And he didn't want to look like a cancer patient with a bald head. He said, you want to look in the mirror and look normal. It's been very important for maintaining a positive outlook. So, yes, the Dignicap works to minimize hair loss from certain chemotherapy treatments for women and men with solid tumors, such as those associated with breast, ovarian, uterine, prostate, and other tissues, according to a news release. So I think it's basically a rubber cap that's infused with cold something, and it basically chills your head. And it means that the chemotherapy does not affect your hair follicles. I mean, this has been around for a little while, but it's just been authorized at the Napa Hospital. Interesting, though. So that's the Napa Valley Registry for Auburn. Or probably the Napa Valley in California, I think. Glen Falls, New York is next. The Post-Star, a fresh blast of winter. Yes, powerful storms rolling through the with snow, ice, high winds. It's sweeping through the US southeast on Sunday, knocking out power, felling trees and fences and coating roads with a treacherous, frigid glaze. Tens of thousands of customers were without power in Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Florida. Highway patrols were reporting hundreds of vehicle accidents, and a tornado ripped through a trailer park in Florida. Yes, I saw some of the images of Florida on the receiving end of this, and, still they have no climate change policies. Still they're just unable to correlate these freak weather incidents with the reality of man-made climate change. It's almost like they will. Here's an example. Ron DeSantis of Florida would stand at a lectern, surrounded by a storm and a hurricane with things flying around, making an announcement that climate change is not real. That's just a metaphor for kind of how he sees it. This stuff is happening in front of his very eyes, and yet he looks, but he does not see. Roger Stone put out a very interesting message about Ron DeSantis yesterday. I don't know if you saw it, but referred to him as like a big baby. It's just very critical. These kind of right-wing characters now are starting to turn on each other. The warfare has begun. And with that comes a very dangerous future. I'd be very interested to see what's going to happen. If they're turning on each other, and there's a higher percentage of Republicans dying because they're not getting vaccinated because of misinformation, then they're just effectively, killing their own people. It's very interesting to me. Warren County Health Service reported 150 new cases and 228 recoveries on Sunday, making the total cases of active COVID at 1,157. 2 more people were hospitalized on Sunday. And Vax program helps poor nations. Yes, this is that same story about the UN-backed COVAX group delivering 1 billion vaccine doses. And classrooms sparse as COVID-19 surges. And interestingly, there's a photograph of a teacher, middle school history teacher, Daniel Santos, wearing a full face covering. And the picture of one of the kids in the classroom looking at him is wearing a blue surgical mask under his nose. Do they not realize that this is a pandemic of the nostrils? This disease floats around and goes up your nose, doesn't go in your mouth. I mean, it can go in your mouth, but it has certainly more chance of affecting you if it goes up your nose. Please mask your nose, young man. The teacher's got a wonderful mask on. I mean, that really is a proper big mask. Lovely. Looks like Darth Vader. It says teachers around the US are confronting classrooms where as many as half of the students are absent because they've been exposed to COVID or their families kept them at home out of concern about the surging coronavirus. From New York City to Seattle, the widespread absences have only added to the difficulty of keeping students on track in yet another pandemic-disrupted school year. This is really taking a toll on the learning. If you have 3 kids in your class one day and you're supposed to have 12, you have to reteach everything 2 weeks later when those kids come back, said a teacher in Kansas. Some of the country's biggest school systems report absentee rates of about 20% or slightly more, with some individual schools seeing far higher percentages of missing students. Very interesting. Okay, so let's move on to the next newspaper. Kobe's with us, Lee's with us. Good morning, good morning. Stacey's with us as well. Hello, Stacey. Thank you for joining us on Martin Luther King Day. Let's go to the New York Times next and see what's happening over on the East Coast for this Monday morning. It's the 17th of January, by the way. I mean, I tell you something, those midterms are going to come around very quickly in the beginning of November. I mean, really, it's very stressful, isn't it? I've been saying this about Biden. By failing to do voting rights in the first instance of becoming president, he's now afforded Republicans this opportunity to fill these state legislatures with Trump sympathizers, and at the same time now delayed the amount of time he has free to make voting rights, certainly try and pass it in the Senate, which is looking increasingly unlikely. He's down to what? 8 months now? 9 months? It's not going to happen, is it? Coffins for many of the victims of the Bronx fire were taken to the Islamic Cultural Center on Sunday for a funeral, and a photograph of these relatives, I presume, pushing the coffin down the street. I mean, it's an incredible image, actually. It's like a convoy of coffins on wheels. Also, DeSantis lurks, Trump stews, and GOP faces loyalty test. That's the headline. It says, for months, former President Trump has been grumbling quietly to friends and visitors to his Palm Beach mansion about a rival Republican power center in another Florida mansion some 400 miles to the north. Yes, Governor Ron DeSantis, a man Mr. Trump believes he put on the map, has been acting far less like an acolyte and more like a future competitor, Mr. Trump complains. With his stock rising fast in the party, the governor has conspicuously refrained from saying he would stand aside if Mr. Trump runs for the Republican nomination for president. The magic words, Trump has said to several associates and advisors. That long stewing resentment burst into public view recently in a dispute over a seemingly unrelated topic, COVID policies, after Mr. DeSantis refused to reveal his full COVID vaccination history. The former president publicly acknowledged he had received a booster, and last week he seemed to swipe at Mr. DeSantis by blasting as gutless politicians who dodged the question out of fear of blowback from vaccine skeptics. Mr. DeSantis shot back on Friday, criticizing Mr. Trump's early handling of the pandemic and saying he regretted not being more vocal in his complaints. The back and forth exposed how far Republicans have shifted to the right on coronavirus politics. Yeah, I mean, it's. I'm actually going to enjoy this back and forth between these two. I mean, it will give me some pleasure. I really enjoy seeing extremists implode. And, tragically, there will only be one winner, and that is Donald Trump. That guy will not stop. And I don't know if you bothered to watch his rally in Arizona. I sat through all of it and watched his entire speech because I think it's important that we do, and I think the network should carry it, and I think it should be broadcast from everywhere, just so people can see what this guy is trying to do and trying to say to his his cult-like following. I say cult-like, it is a cult. There's a very good psychologist, Stephen Hassan, who's doing a podcast at the moment. He wrote a book called The Cult of Trump, and he's doing a very interesting podcast that I've started listening to about cults and about brainwashing and all of the rhetoric that Trump uses to bring people in, to lure them, and then to capture them in his group. It's very interesting, Trump knows he's doing it. He doesn't know how he's doing it because he doesn't have an intellect, so he's not able to kind of analyze himself. But he is still using these cult-like tactics, nonetheless. And the thing is, very intelligent people can be taken and drawn into a cult. Very well-read, educated people. Everybody has vulnerabilities. Doesn't matter where you sit, academically or socially, everybody has vulnerabilities. And cults are able to expose your vulnerabilities, and you can be drawn in. And this is why you have some very smart people who are followers of the cult of Donald Trump. And, this is why I don't criticize people for it. I don't blame them for it. I recognize that everybody is vulnerable. And the downside to it, though, is it is, a very increasingly extremist view of the world, and isolationist view of the world, and xenophobic view of the world. And yesterday he said something that I could not believe. He said that the vaccine is only being given to non-white people. Right? This is completely insane. He said that if you want to get, because he confused the vaccine with therapeutics on purpose, and he said that whites, because he wants to make America white again, that whites have to go to the back of the queue to get treatment for COVID-19. And he repeated it several times. It wasn't an accident. And this is, unfortunately, where his head is now. It's just like the gloves have come off. The guy is just going for it now. He doesn't care. He knows that he can say all this stuff and not be prosecuted because it's happened so many times before. This is where it's at now. He really is. He's there. China lockdown ramps up stress on supply chain on the front of the New York Times. It says companies are bracing for another round of potentially debilitating supply chain disruptions as China, home to about a third of global manufacturing, imposes sweeping lockdowns in an attempt to keep the Omicron variant at bay. I don't know. I kind of feel like they should let it in, I mean, I'm starting to think now that if we can do it slowly over time, because there's been such a huge infection rate, that if everyone's vaccinated, let the Omicron in. But only once everyone's vaccinated. For CDC, fast moves, scant data is the headline. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention was long revered for its methodical and meticulous scientific approach. Agencies in other nations modeled themselves after the world's most highly regarded public health authority, even adopting the name. At the outset of the pandemic, the CDC moved at its accustomed pace, but this time, with a novel coronavirus moving so quickly, the country paid a price. Testing and surveillance lagged as the agency tried to implement dated approaches with creaky infrastructure. Officials were late to recommend masking, in part because federal scientists took too long to recognize that the virus was airborne. Now, the contagious Omicron variant is pushing the CDC into uncharted territory because decisions must be made at a breakneck pace. The agency has issued recommendations based on what once would have been considered insufficient evidence amid growing public concern about how these guidelines affect the economy and education. So, there it is. Rochelle Walensky has sometimes skipped much of the traditional scientific review process, most recently shortening the isolation period for infected Americans. It says after the Trump administration's pattern of interference, President Biden came to office, promising to restore the CDC's reputation for independence and rigorous science. The challenge now for Dr. Walensky is figuring out how to convey this message to the public. The science is incomplete, and this is our best advice for now. For a bureaucracy staffed primarily by medical professionals, the change has not been easy. Privately, CDC officials have described the decisions as demoralizing, worried about Dr. Walensky's increasing reliance on a small group of advisors and what they saw as the White House's heavy political influence on her actions. Yet others outside of the agency commended Dr. Walensky for short-circuiting a laborious process and taking a pragmatic approach to managing a national emergency, saying she was right to move ahead even when the data was still unclear. So there we go. That's the New York Times. There's just one final story here that I wanted to mention. Actually, there's two more stories on the front of the New York Times likes to pack its stories in. It does go for the slightly smaller version of the article, and then they continue everything on page 5, which is one gigantic page full of continuations. This is the story about the Texas Synagogue hostage taker, because it turns out the guy was British. He'd actually flown in from the UK. So firstly, I think I should start with an apology. Fortunately, all of the hostages were okay. It says just before New Year's Eve, a 44-year-old man from an industrial city in the north of England landed at Kennedy International Airport. On his travel documents, he listed his destination as a hotel on the Queens Boulevard. His arrival raised no red flags. 2 weeks later, without explanation, he entered a service at a synagogue in suburban Fort Worth, Texas, some 1,600 miles from Queens and some 4,800 miles from his home. Thus began an 11-hour ordeal on Saturday that was partly live-streamed, captured the nation's attention, and ended dramatically in a barrage of flashes and gunfire that left him dead and 4 people he had held captive, unharmed and thankful for their lives. On Sunday, the authorities identified the man as Malik Faisal Akram, a British citizen. What drew him to Texas is still a mystery, though a possible motivation emerged as investigators reviewed the ranting demands he made as he held captive the rabbi and 3 other members of the synagogue congregation. Biden called for the hostage-taking an act of terror, and British authorities confirmed the counter-terrorism police were involved in their investigation. Well, here's my theory, and I just want to throw this out there. Carla, you might be interested in this, but think about it for a second. Anybody who is radicalized, based on this guy's plan, from what I can see, and I don't know anything about him, and I don't know a huge amount about the siege because I chose not to watch it. But he has decided to fly from a country where you have no access to weapons to a country and to a city, he goes into New York and then on to Texas. To Texas, where you could go into any gun store and buy a weapon, right? So he could have gone and bought a weapon, because he obviously didn't bring a weapon in with him on the plane. He obviously thought, well, where can I go and just buy a gun? So that's why the guy ends up in Texas, because, of course, Texas gun laws are non-existent in comparison to New York State and certainly the United Kingdom. So the guy, he wants to do this. He's been radicalized. He, through via the internet and whatever else, he chooses to go somewhere where he knows he can very easily pick up a firearm, cause havoc, become a martyr. It's a death mission, isn't it? It's a kamikaze mission. The guy knows he's probably going to be killed. He probably doesn't want to kill anybody, but he does want to, hold people hostage. He didn't sound like a terrible, murderous killer I heard some of his voice. I found it kind of interesting to hear this guy's northern accent. He had this kind of weird mix of a British northern accent, mixed with something else. And, he died in his faith. He would have died as a martyr. It's a very interesting concept, because what this does is it now moves the goalposts yet again. Because before, we had extremists hijacking aircraft. But they don't have to do that now. They can fly in legally to America. They can then travel to a state with minimal gun laws, purchase a weapon, and then go do something. In this case, that's what he's done, This is really what we're dealing with now, isn't it? Now it's like the idea that you can take advantage of laws or lack of laws in certain US states to commit atrocities. And this is another reason why gun control needs to be back on the statute book, right? Because, these states like Texas and Arizona and elsewhere, where this desire to bear arms is more important than the lives of children in schools, is a loophole for potential terrorists. It's a loophole. And this guy, Malik Faisal Akram, a British citizen, has taken advantage of these loopholes. You know, and it's always a sign of things to come, because he's set a bit of a precedent now, hasn't he? We should also talk a little bit about that tsunami wave off the back of the volcanic explosion in Tonga, because that was one of the most remarkable pieces of footage I've ever seen. Really, blew my mind. But the other headline I wanted to mention on the front of the New York Times is, as attendance falls, now is the winter of Broadway's discontent. It says the reopening of Broadway last summer, following the longest shutdown in history, provided a jolt of energy to a city ready for a rebound. Bruce Springsteen and block parties, eager audiences and enthusiastic actors. But the Omicron variant that has barreled into the city, sending coronavirus case counts soaring, is now battering Broadway, leaving the industry facing an unexpected and enormous setback on its road back from the pandemic. Well, yeah, if you think about it, if you're an actor or a showman or somebody who works within the theatre community, you are, Omicron is so much more transmissible than Delta. Because you know how small conditions are backstage at theatres, especially in New York. The backstage areas are just tiny. I mean, there's not a huge amount of room for the legs of the audience members, but backstage it's very small. Omicron would just rage through those halls, those corridors, and those dressing rooms. Take out entire swathes of the company. And yet, you can't really fight against it. I mean, this is my new view now, especially having children, is that it's like you just have to prepare yourself for the fact that you are going to get it at some point. You hope it's going to be mild. You'll be off for up to a week, and then you'll hopefully get back on again with some renewed confidence that you're probably not going to get it again anytime soon. But for the theatres, I actually think reopening was a foolish move. I think they should have just, furloughed people, paid their wages, or a percentage of their wages, knowing that they were going to have to ride this out. Everybody knew that this thing was going to mutate. Alexis, good morning. Thank you for joining us on Backchannel. Christopher is here as well. Nice to know that you're part of the show. It's 9:35 on the West Coast, 12:35 Eastern, and you can write to me at backchannel.tv, or just wake up your device, say the word "say," and then your message. So that's the New York Times this morning. Let's move on to the St. Lucie News Tribune from Fort Pierce, Florida. Brought line train to run through Treasure Coast is the headline. Oh, Bright Light train, I'm sorry. It's their first test train from Palm Beach to Cocoa, which is set to roll through the Treasure Coast on Tuesday. Will mark another milestone in the higher speed railroad's completion of the 168-mile extension from South Florida to Orlando. Oh, well, that's good, because I've actually driven from South Florida to Orlando to go to Disney. And it's a very long way. So if there's a higher speed train, I like the way they don't call it a high speed train, because it's not actually that fast, this train. It's a higher speed train. The Tuesday run, postponed from Monday, will mark the first time a Brightline train travels north of Palm Beach County. The entire $4.5 billion project between Miami and Orlando was first announced in 2012 and was due to be completed by 2014. Oh my goodness, it's like 8 years late. Now the $2.7 billion extension is to be completed late this year, with service set to begin in early 2023. Oh, it's 9 years late. Connecting downtown Miami and Orlando International Airport. Construction is more than 70% complete. Interesting. I do love a train. I love a train. I love a ship. I love an aeroplane. I'm very into travel. Less about the destination for me and more about how you get there. But everyone's different. 27 homes destroyed as tornadoes hammer state. That's right. This is Fort Myers. Storms pummeled southwest Florida on Sunday morning, with at least 3 reports of tornadoes touching down and 27 homes destroyed. More than 60 Lee County houses overall were left uninhabitable. Lee County Commissioner confirmed that at least 4 injuries were discovered from the storms. while the fire district officials reported there were others in areas of South Fort Myers, which was hit particularly hard. No deaths were reported. And a photograph of the home, of a home that was ripped apart by the twister. It was an EF2 tornado with winds of 118 miles an hour, according to the National Weather Service. This is climate change. Climate change. In a county or in a state that kind of denies its existence. Also, will new abortion bill spark political firestorm? The opening day of the Florida legislature's 2022 session, abortion opponents sparked a battle that reproductive rights activists said will continue until the November election. Encouraged by new restrictions enacted in Mississippi and Texas and emboldened by the questions justices asked during a U.S. Supreme Court hearing of the Mississippi law, 2 GOP women lawmakers have filed a 15-week abortion ban for colleagues to consider during the 60-day session. Currently, abortion is legal up to 24 weeks in the state and later in the case of an emergency. It said this falls under the "be careful what you ask for" part of American politics. Florida State University communications professor Davis C. Houck said. The political rhetoric and movements expert says the proposal could ignite the usual political firestorm. Well, this is what I was saying about this the other day, is that if you ban abortion in a state that has got women in it, and there is apparently some women in Florida, then you are basically denying your own people access to healthcare in 2022. Denying people access to healthcare. The stars are already aligning in favor of Governor Ron DeSantis soon after the bill was released. He said a 15-week ban makes sense. I mean, I don't know. I find their rhetoric to be so antiquated. It's very hard for me to kind of have an opinion without getting upset. Let's look at the Florida Times-Union now. By the way, if you have a newspaper that you would like to have us review, then you're very welcome to mention it. Just to drop us a note. Kobe says weekday virus to be over. Okay. Okay, Jacksonville now. Florida Times-Union. Honoring the civil rights icon's legacy. Martin Luther King Day. And an image of Martin Luther King on the front of the Florida Times-Union. City honors Martin Luther King despite splits. Yes, it says, despite their divisive history and separate hosts and speakers, Jacksonville's 2 virtual celebrations of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s civil rights legacy offered similarly positive conclusions. The theme of the event, hosted by the local branch of the NAACP, was King's last book, Where Do We Want to Go From Here? Chaos or Community? A local educator and activist, Rudy Jameson Jr., a Jacksonville native, answered the book's title question in his keynote speech. He said the answer, growing up on Jacksonville's east side, where poverty was concentrated but community was abundant. Although chaos was present, community prevailed, and he sees it now. He says today's socio-political climate would have you believe there is a possibility for America to move toward chaos. Jameson, a faculty member and assistant director of University of North Florida's Center for Urban Education and Policy, said, "However, I submit the universal character of America will ultimately move us towards community." I really hope he's right. My worry, though, is that might be true of the streets, but it's not true of the internet. And the metaverse is going to become the prevalent space for this warfare. That's my concern. People be very nice to each other on the street, but online they take their happy faces off and their true self is revealed. You know, behind the cover of an avatar or a fake name. That's my concern. People's true colors come out under the veil of online chatter. Have you seen the film Ready Player One? It's a Spielberg movie. It's definitely worth watching because it is really the closest view, I think, of where we're heading. It's where people are living in poverty, and yet they all have a high-end computer VR system at home. And they basically can't wait to get home so that they can enter this metasphere and be in this virtual world as an avatar. So they take on a different look and they meet their friends and they hang out and they fight and they shop and they do all of these fun things in the virtual space. They rarely live in their reality. And of course, there's a totalitarian government and they're always trying to shut people down or make arrests or disappear people like Donald Trump's administration did, famously in Portland, just disappearing people off the streets, unmarked officers in unmarked cars. And it's a very interesting metaphor for where things are heading or where things maybe already are here in the US and across the wider world. But Ready Player One, it's a very good fun film. But there is a hidden message in there, a little bit like Don't Look Up on Netflix. There is a message there about democracy and about climate change. And I think that, there's a lot of these films coming along now. Ready Player One. It's about 3 or 4 years old now. But I watched it again the other day, and I just think it's a really, really good film. I mean, Spielberg is a master filmmaker. And sometimes his films kind of cut through. I mean, West Side Story that he just did, which I saw in the cinema, my only visit to the cinema in over 2 years, has bombed effectively. No one's gone to see it. I'm sure it'll do very well when it streams, though. Let's have a look. Where are we going now? Measure would prevent church closures, it says, after high-profile disputes in various parts of the country about shuttering churches during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Florida Senate is poised to take up a proposal that would help prevent closures of religious institutions during future emergencies. The Senate Rules Committee voted 13-1 late last week to support a measure intended to shield in-person religious services from being shut down because of emergency orders. It says, the bill sponsor said religious institutions would still have to close if lockdown orders were applied to all businesses in a crisis, such as a hurricane. But basically, if Target and Publix are open, so too should the religious institutions be. Interesting. So measure would prevent church closures. Senate poised to take up the proposal. And after fights for Afghans and US soldier is welcomed to new home. This is Kahan and Shamila's baby girl was born inside a US military transport aeroplane after the couple fled a collapsing Afghanistan just as the plane landed safely at an airbase in Qatar. A simple piece of printer paper produced by a US airman serves as her birth certificate, but she has no citizenship, no country yet that she can claim. So her parents named her Dunya, which means the world, for it's the world, they said, to which she belongs. Thursday evening, not quite 5 months old, Dunya and her family made it to their new home, a comfortable apartment at the beaches. Her father, Kayhan, an Afghan army helicopter pilot and interpreter who fought alongside American forces, already has dreams for her. He hopes she'll grow up in this new country and become a pilot for the US military. Isn't that wonderful? An Afghan family, rescued, brought back to the US by an organization called Save Our Allies, helped them get out of Afghanistan and to the Jacksonville community. Staying there was just too dangerous. So there it is. You know, we are seeing the fruits of the labor, you know, of the effort, because, you know, there's a lot of criticism of that retreat, evacuation, effectively, from Afghanistan. And in my opinion, in my view, it was actually a very successful mission. You know, it was very successful. And I feel like we need to remember that the work that goes on, you know, the good work that goes on is actually, I mean, it's so difficult, isn't it, to evacuate that many people from a war zone. I mean, it's so difficult. And yet we are criticizing that evacuation effort all the time. And it just makes no sense to me why we would do that. You know? Makes no sense. Because it was successful. It was a successful exit, a retreat in a war zone. You know? It's makes no sense to me. Okay, let's move on a little bit if we can. Let's go to the Telegraph then. From Georgia. Yes, that's right. Biden did go there. Snow, ice blast through south with powerful winter storm is the headline. They say a dangerous winter storm combining high winds and ice was sweeping parts of the southwest US on Sunday, knocking out power, felling trees and fences and coating the roads with treacherous frigid glaze. That's actually the same Associated Press article from the other newspaper. It's exactly the same words. That's what they do. They just reprint articles verbatim. Warner Robins drive-up coffee shop offers fresh beegnets. What's a beegnet? Don't even know what that is. Cafe Vignette in Warner Robins. On a recent visit to the small drive-up coffee. What's a beegnet? I mean, is this an American word that I've never heard before? Interesting. Oh, it's a deep-fried pastry. Am I saying it right, though? I don't know. I've never heard of it. Beignet, there you go. It's a French type of word. Oh, it's a New Orleans style thing. Yeah. It starts with mixing the dough with just the right amount of water, rolling the dough out, cutting it into rectangular pieces. Then you deep fry the dough pieces, making sure the dough turned the right shade of brown and throwing out any pieces that didn't pass the high standards. Pastries were then placed in a paper bag with a liberal dousing of powdered sugar. That's how each of the beignet, did I get that right? What is it? Say it again. Beignet. That's how the beignet, generally 3 to an order, are made fresh once a customer places their order. Interesting. And then, of course, Georgia Republicans rankled by Biden's voting rights agenda. It says President Joe Biden put the spotlight on Georgia when he traveled to Atlanta on January 11 to pitch federal voting rights legislation stalled in the U.S. Senate. But to the Peach State's Republican leaders, it was an unwelcome attention. They bristled at the Democratic president's portrayal of the Peach State as ground zero for a GOP-led voter suppression movement aimed at reversing Republican losses in 2020. We're the number one state in the nation for election integrity, Georgia House Speaker David Wolfson said the day after Biden's visit. More Georgians are voting now than ever before. Indeed, record voter turnout in November helped Biden become the first Democratic presidential candidate to carry Georgia since Bill Clinton in 1992. 2 months later, another huge turnout lifted Democrats Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock to victory over two incumbent Republican senators in runoff elections. Georgia Republicans reacted by passing sweeping election overhaul legislation last month. Among other things, the bill requires voters casting absentee ballots to present ID. It also limits the number of absentee ballot drop boxes, which became a popular method of voting in 2020. While Republicans argued such steps promote election integrity, Democrats charged they were part of an effort by the GOP to make it harder for voters, particularly voters of color, to cast ballots. Minority voters historically have supported Democratic candidates. Warnock made a business case against the new state law in favor of federal voting rights legislation January 12 when he spoke at the annual Eggs and Issues breakfast sponsored by the Georgia Chamber of Commerce. He said Georgia's new restrictions on voting have cost the state business investment, notably Major League Baseball's decision to pull last summer's All-Star game out of Georgia. He said voter suppression is not good for business. Opening up voter access is the right thing to do and the smart thing to do. But in an election year, some Georgia Republicans are looking to double down on the election law changes the General Assembly adopted last year. State Senate President pro tempore Butch Miller, who is running for lieutenant governor, has introduced legislation to abolish drop boxes altogether and a constitutional amendment prohibiting non-US citizens from voting. Warnock said the General Assembly should not consider getting rid of drop boxes while COVID-19 is still a threat. I mean, drop boxes, when you're talking about states like, for example, Louisville in Kentucky, which has just one polling place. I admit it's a big one, but people have to travel miles, and there they don't allow drop boxes. And so you're now talking about states that are preventing people from voting purposely. So only the ones that are able to give up half a day to go vote are the ones who'll be able to cast a ballot. And, ID, I mean, it's just, this is the other thing. You have to, in order to get a mail-in ballot, you have to apply for one. And the way you put in a ballot application is you show ID. There's 3 ways of showing ID, through Social Security and photo ID and various other ways. That's how you apply for a ballot. There shouldn't need to be ID once you have your ballot. Applying to vote is when you show ID. I mean, this is something that obviously is the biggest topic of the day, isn't it? This issue of voting rights, but more importantly, voter suppression, which is what all of these bills are trying to deal with. And what these federal bills will do is they will override these state laws that have been imposed recently to prevent people, black or brown people, from voting. I mean, it's as simple as that. And it's proven. I mean, it's not even, it's not even a theory. So if you'd like to get in touch and join us on this conversation, then you're very welcome to, of course. You can just wake up your device, then say, and then your message. You can also Go to backchannel.tv and you can message me there as well. No need to register. You just put your name in and where you're from, and that's it. We can chat. The Los Angeles Times on this Monday morning, January 17, leads with GOP's midterm Senate dilemma. It says the final two Senate Republican incumbents who had not revealed their 2022 re-election intentions announced recently that they plan to run again, and their races provide a look at the opposing efforts the GOP is taking in regard to Donald Trump as it fights to recapture the Senate majority. Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, who previously said he would not seek a third term, has embraced the former president, even suggesting without evidence that the FBI had knowledge of the January 6th insurrection and did nothing to stop it. That is, of course, a lie. Senator John Thune of South Dakota, the chamber's number 2 Republican, who was heavily lobbied by his party against retiring, squared off against Trump in late 2020 over the presidential election results, prompting the former president to seek out a primary rival against him. Well, this spring, Republican voters in states with contested primaries will determine whether the remaining slate of GOP Senate candidates looks more like Thune or Johnson, with broad implications for future makeup of the Senate Republican Conference. The 50-50 split in the Senate means Republicans need to get net just one additional seat to regain control of the chamber, and with it significant power to shape President Biden's legislative agenda and judicial appointments for the second half of his term. Midterm elections historically disfavor the president's party, so Republicans have a strong chance. I mean, there's been so many predictions by so many scholars and analysts that America is going to fall into the hands of the far right this year and then on to 2024. And by 2024 and beyond, American democracy will be confined to the halls of history, and that there will not be such a thing as a democratic country where you get a free and fair vote, especially if you are of a minority group. And everyone's saying it. I mean, it's not going to come as a surprise. And the tragedy is that Republicans don't care, because to them, power is more important than democracy, because this is their fundamental racist roots. So the answer is to rebrand the Democratic Party, because do you remember I've been saying that, the Republicans think that democracy is exclusive to Democrats. So I was thinking that actually Democrats need to call themselves Democratic Republicans. Think about it. Because if you're trying to protect the Republic should not be the opposite of democracy. You need a democratic republic. But because Republicans are not democratic Republicans anymore, they are authoritarian Republicans, you need to embrace the Republican phrase. So the Democrats need to rebrand as the Democratic Republicans, or as the social Republicans. I really do genuinely feel like there is a branding issue here that could be easily remedied. Let Democrats rebrand as Republicans, because Democrats clearly want to save the Republic, and Republicans are really not fussed. Is it possible? Do you think that this is something that Democrats would consider seriously, a name change within the next 3 months? Democratic Republicans. Think about it. It's brilliant. Because there's probably a good percentage of Republicans who are not Trump supporters, who don't want to be part of Trump's regime, who don't see it as being healthy for America. Would they be more likely to join Democratic Republicans? Because the problem is that Democrats have been painted by Republicans as socialists and communists in the case of Bernie Sanders, and it's just not true. Biden is one of the most moderate, kind of centrist Democrats of all. So that's the solution to my mind, is to rebrand the Democrats as Democratic Republicans, not conservatives. And then maybe Republicans can rebrand as authoritarian Republicans or far-right Republicans or just conservative Republicans. Although saying that, there's plenty of conservatives in the Democratic Party. Because I maintain my view that democracy sounds like it is exclusive to Democrats. And Republicans don't want to own democracy because it sounds like it is exclusive to Democrats. So they go the other way. What a mess. The American experiment has really failed, hasn't it? I mean, this really is the failure. They've now downgraded American democracy on the world stage by 2 levels. They've literally downgraded it. It is not upheld now as being one of the great bastions of freedom anymore. Been downgraded twice. The LA Times also leads with variant may be deadlier than first thought. It says Los Angeles County saw an average of 40 coronavirus deaths a day over the last week, and the highest such rate in nearly 10 months. A sign that the prolific Omicron variant may be deadlier than many initially believed. The county's daily COVID-19 death rate has doubled in just a week, officials said. According to a Times analyst, the last average daily deaths have been this high was for the 7-day period that ended on March 28. The daily death tally in the county has climbed dramatically in recent days. On Tuesday, 15 deaths were reported. Wednesday, 39, Thursday, 45, Friday, 48, the highest number in more than 9 months. As deaths often lag behind surges in cases and hospitalizations, sadly, the increase in deaths does not come as a surprise. And tragically, we are prepared for even higher numbers of deaths in the coming weeks, said LA County Public Health Director Barbara Ferrer. The latest average daily death figure remains well below that of the peak of last winter, when very few people were vaccinated because of limited supply. At that time, LA County was averaging about 240 COVID-19 deaths a day. Yes, a lot of people have been saying this, downplaying Omicron's severity is a mistake because, it can kill you. Invariably, one has to have comorbidities and, be immunocompromised or have other issues that have prevented you getting vaccinated, but it is just as deadly. Also on the front of the LA Times, an escalating fight over the unhoused. It says, for the last year, Los Angeles County City Councilman Kevin De Leon has focused much of his energy on reducing the number of encampments in the East Side District, working with city agencies to move people off the streets and into temporary housing or other forms of shelter. Last spring, he said his office succeeded in moving 74 homeless people off a median strip in El Sereno and into converted motels. 6 months later, dozens more were relocated from a 2-block section of Main Street in downtown. And since Thanksgiving, his team, working alongside outreach workers, moved about 90 people out of encampments that have long surrounded El Pueblo, the Los Angeles Historical Monument. It is, if you are living in an area which has a proliferation of homelessness, because, I was talking to somebody from Florida the other day and they said, you don't really see much of it. And I was like, well, you know why, don't you? It's because they just ship them out. It's not because there's not homeless people there. It's because it's illegal. Yeah, the amount of homelessness here in Los Angeles is insane. And it's partly because of the climate. It is warm here, and it is a society that is more generous. towards the unhoused. So what's it like where you live? Maybe you live in a place where fundamentally homelessness is become an epidemic of its own, because here it's out of control. But I say that with warmth and kindness, because these people have to live somewhere, and the streets are the only option. What I don't understand is people that refer to them as vermin and have no respect for their fellow man. And I see this on Nextdoor. I look on the community website Nextdoor when I'm buying and selling garbage, and invariably there's always threads about homelessness, and people just go absolutely hell for leather in criticizing these people, and it's really quite tragic. Yeah, the hidden homeless. Yeah, I mean, this is I don't know. I mean, Gavin Newsom, who's the governor here, is he spends more on homelessness than anything else. He really is investing hugely in it. But it's a problem that will never go away because of the bottom-feeding nature of the economy. If the cost of living is so high, and if the housing stock is in short supply, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Another story about Afghanistan. Girls who live as boys gain freedom. This is interesting. It says, in a Kabul neighborhood, a gaggle of boys kick a yellow ball around a dusty playground, their boisterous cries echoing off the surrounding apartment buildings. Dressed in sweaters and jeans or the traditional Afghan male clothing of baggy pants and long shirt, none stand out as they jostle to score a goal. But unbeknownst to them, one is different from the others. At not quite 8 years old, Sanam is a bacha posh, or a girl living as a boy. One day, a few months ago, the girl with rosy cheeks and an impish smile had her dark hair cut short, donned boys' clothes, and took on a boy's name, Omid. The move opened up a boy's world, playing soccer and cricket with boys, wrestling with the neighborhood butcher's son, working to help the family make ends meet. If in Afghanistan's heavily patriarchal, male-dominated society, where women and girls are usually relegated to the home, bacha posh is one way of, I guess, integrating. It's very interesting, isn't it? That story continues on page 5. It's very interesting to me. There's a whole, there really is a whole, underworld, secret world that we know very little about. That is, I'm amazed that these are the lengths that people have to go to. Do you understand? To have to effectively hide your gender in order to be, to integrate with people. It's just beggars belief that this is even a thing. And yet, these are the lengths that people have to go to just to lead a relatively normal life. I had no idea that this kind of thing went on, but the more I think about it, the more obvious it seems that this is what you would do. If boys are allowed to do all these things, to be publicly enjoying themselves, and women are relegated, then be a boy. The downside to being a boy, I guess, is that with that will come other issues and responsibilities. Will you be conscripted into the Taliban? It's there's so much there. Throughout history, women have disguised themselves as men to navigate entrenched social roles. They've dressed as men to fight wars, join religious orders, or prosper professionally. In Afghanistan, some families raise their daughters as sons to provide them with a better life. It says, when one gender is so important and the other is unwanted, there will always be those who try to pass over to the other side. In Afghanistan's patriarchal society, economic dependency on men and social stigma put parents in a difficult spot. Daughters are often considered as a burden, while a son will earn money, carry on the family legacy, and stay home to care for their aging parents. To counter this, some reassign their daughter's gender at birth in a practice known as bachaposh. There's even a rumor that a bachaposh daughter will lead to a son in the next pregnancy. It's insane, isn't it? It says this tradition allows the family to avoid the social stigma associated with not having any male children. These girls dressed as boys may go outside for shopping alone, bring their sisters from school, get a job, play a sport, and play any other roles of a boy in society. The origins of the practice are still unknown, but it's become increasingly well known. I had no idea about this. I mean, think about how sad it is as well for these girls. Because, we're not talking about people who are transgender. We're talking about people, some of them might be transgender randomly. But we're talking about people who are being forced to dress up as the opposite sex. And I'm sure some of them do it willingly because they'll probably have more fun. But at the same time, there will be plenty that will cry themselves to sleep at night, that they're living in a society where this is necessary. Well, it's a brainwashing to a certain extent, isn't it? Because I wonder whether it's done in a way where they purposely bring the children up in the wrong gender. Because then you have someone being reverse trans. They'll be like, I think I'm a girl. I have lady parts, and yet I am a boy. It's a very confusing evolutionary construct, isn't it? To be brought up as a gender that is not your birth gender. But it's different with trans people because trans people don't have the genitals that are assigned to their, they don't have the appropriate genitals for their gender. But here they do. They just have the wrong clothes and the wrong haircut. It's fascinating. It says boys have a higher status. Everyone wants a boy, particularly in lower income families. If you have a lot of girls and no boys, it's a normal thing to do. But as they get older and puberty reveals their biological gender, life becomes difficult and dangerous. This family has moved the family multiple times to avoid the harassment. On the street, people yell that they are anti-Islamic and call them transsexual. Their father drives Ali to school, so she gets there safely, and Sitar stopped going because she got fed up with being called names. Both parents now want them to start dressing and behaving like girls, but neither Ali or Sitar want to. It's really hard to be a woman in Afghanistan, and you don't have a lot of options. Even in these cases, you haven't decided this for yourself. Someone else has decided for you. These girls have had a little bit of freedom, and then all of a sudden they go back to being women in a country where women have no possibilities. And even fewer possibilities now that Afghanistan is under Taliban rule, of course. The Taliban 2.0 pretended at the very beginning that they were going to do things differently, and now, of course, they've reverted back to their old ways. It's really very tragic. So this charity, Women for Afghan Women, sees at least 2 cases of bachaposh a year in the women's shelter they run in Kabul. The caseworkers find them particularly challenging. The girls suffer harassment, humiliation, and separation from the community, but often they don't want to start living as women. Gendered cultural restrictions are difficult to adopt in later life. They must learn how to live under a burqa, cook for their families, and lower their gaze among strangers. When she becomes mature and older, she learns that it's not possible for her to be a boy, and nobody accepts her as a girl. This is a repression, ignoring girls' ability and talent and rights, denying the religious and Islamic rights of a girl, in fact, an insult to the sex of a girl. We read this and we think of it as being so alien and strange, and yet there are very similar things happening quite recently in America, banning trans people from the military under the previous administration, or banning abortion, with a woman's right to choose. I mean, it's different, but it's also the same. Fundamentally, these are women's rights. These are trans rights. These are human rights. Yeah, I was just looking at that. It says, "Don't Fight, a guide for teens with anti-vaccination parents." This is on the front of the Los Angeles Times today. It says, when he has small slices of free time wedged in between schoolwork and studying for academic quiz competitions, Aaron Parser scrolls through Reddit. The 14-year-old from San Jose searches for posts about vaccines and comments whenever he thinks he can be helpful, sometimes sharing a public health department hotline or congratulating a poster on overcoming a fear of needles. Last fall, Aaron, who founded an organization called Teens for Vaccines, spotted a post from a 16-year-old in Ohio who said his parents were opposed to the COVID-19 shots. "Can I get vaccinated without my parents' consent?" the boy wrote. "No, not in Ohio," Aaron responded, before adding a note of encouragement, "You aren't alone," and sharing a link to a guide he helped create for teens hoping to persuade their parents to let them be vaccinated. A couple of tips from the guide include talking to your parents when they seem relaxed and emailing them information so they can look over it when they're less busy. Wait for a good time. Don't fight, it reads. Wow. That is interesting, isn't it? Of course, children are increasingly exposed to information, both misinformation and accurate information, and I hope that an increasing number of teens recognize that some of their parents are probably down the rabbit hole, following the vaccine skeptics who claim that it's a bioweapon or that it's untested or that it's in some way dangerous, Let's remind you that Backchannel has a growing list of shows, including Haley and Allison Live, waking you up in the morning with lots of laughs, and their one-star cinema review, or Live Every Day with Liv Harrison live from Texas, celebrating the little things in life with plenty of coffee. Or what about the charming and funny Hal Rudnick, whose program Your Pal Hal usually starts at 11 o'clock. I don't know if he's on today. Is he not? No. Okay, because it's Martin Luther King Day. Didn't stop us, though. Because we felt that talking about civil rights was more important than having a day off. Indiana representative introduced Martin Luther King Day bill. This is on the front of the Corpus Christi Caller-Times. It says, attempts to make Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday a federal holiday failed for 15 years following his assassination. But on the 2nd of November 1983, a black congresswoman from Indiana succeeded. Her name was Katie Beatrice Hall. She was the first African American to be elected to the U.S. Congress in the state, and the woman that sponsored and introduced the bill that became law that recognized Martin Luther King Jr. Day as a federal holiday. Indiana Historical Society Director of Education and Engagement, Bethany Harachevek, called the achievement incredibly significant. The Society's upcoming Martin Luther King Day Jr. celebration, Martin Luther King Jr. Day celebration, will include a presentation on Hall. Says there was a lot of immediate local response to Dr. King's assassination. Streets were named, some communities recognized the holiday, some states did, but there was nothing on the federal level. So former U.S. Representative John Coyers Jr. of Michigan made the first legislative attempt to honor King 4 days after his death in 1968. A bill was introduced every year after, but it was Hall, Beatrice Hall, Katie Beatrice Hall, within a year of her first term in office, who was able to push the bill through. She carried a passion for seeing the bill's passage. The time is before us to show what we believe, that justice and equality must continue to prevail, not only as individuals, but as the greatest nation in this world. One of 12 children, Hall was born in Mississippi in 1938. Her parents were farmers without much money. She showed up to Mississippi Valley State with just $5 in her pocket, seeking a bachelor's degree. And there's a photograph of President Ronald Reagan signing the bill on November 2nd, 1983, to nationalize Martin Luther King Day as a federal holiday. Can you imagine a Republican president or any Republican congressperson being involved in such kind of legislation now? Are we more divided than ever before? Are we more racist than ever before? That's my concern. I mean, when I was watching the Trump rally yesterday, there was some crazy newscaster from some far-right news channel going around and filming people, talking to people, and interviewing people. And it was a sea of white people. There was no black people to be seen. It was a sea of whites. And yet, when Trump got up on the stage to do his speech, there was strategically placed black people behind him wearing Blacks for Trump t-shirts. All, most likely, paid actors. Paid actors, that's what he does. He pays ethnic minority people to sit behind him to give the impression that there is potentially one, other than Larry Elder, black person that is willing to buy into his racist, divisive, xenophobic rhetoric. Dems win in other states, so why not in Texas? This is an interesting story on the front of the Caller Times this morning. Pop quiz question 1. What do the states of Louisiana, Kansas, Kentucky, and Texas have in common when it comes to politics? Answer: all have gone Republican in every presidential election this century. Question 2. Pull Texas out of the mix, and what do you have in common? Answer: they are all currently run by Democratic governors. That's something Texas has not been able to claim in almost 28 years. In fact, Democrats haven't won any statewide elections in that long, and there have been about 100 of them during that time. By way of illustration, an online site for lottery players puts the odds of someone matching at least 3 of the 6 numbers in a Texas lotto, drawing about 1 in 75. The payout for hitting 3 of 6 is a modest $3. But it still means a Texas Democrat has a better chance of winning at least part of the lotto jackpot than he or she has of getting elected statewide. I mean, it's just, there's just nothing fair about elections anymore, is there? And this is my point about, why this terrorist decided to head for Texas. Flies from England to New York and then heads for Texas. Because he knows that it's a place where he can purchase a gun and no one's going to ask him why. If anything, they're going to hope that he might use it to do harm onto the type of people that they despise. The newspaper also leads with Texas rabbi captor grew belligerent late in standoff. It says a rabbi who was among 4 people held hostage at the Texas Synagogue said on Sunday their armed captor grew increasingly belligerent and threatening toward the end of the 10-hour standoff, which ended with an FBI SWAT team rushing into the building and the captor's death. Authorities identified the hostage taker as 44-year-old British national Malik Faisal Akram, who was killed on Saturday night after the last hostages ran out of the congregation. The FBI said there was no indication that anyone else was involved, but it had not provided a possible motive. Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker credited security training that his suburban Fort Worth congregation has received over the years for getting him and the other 3 hostages through the ordeal, which he described as traumatic. In the last hour of our hostage crisis, the gunman became increasingly belligerent and threatening. Without the instruction we received, we would not have been prepared to act and flee the situation as it presented itself. Joe Biden called the episode an act of terror. Akram could be heard ranting on a Facebook live stream of the services and demanding the release of Afia Siddiqui, a Pakistani neuroscientist suspected of having ties to Al-Qaeda, who was convicted of trying to kill US Army officers in Afghanistan. Speaking to reporters in Philadelphia on Sunday, Biden said Akram allegedly purchased a weapon on the streets. Federal investigators believe Akram purchased the handgun used in the hostage-taking in a private sale, according to a person familiar with the matter, who spoke on condition of anonymity because the investigation is ongoing. Akram arrived at the U.S. at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York about 2 weeks ago. Video from Dallas TV station WFAA showed people running out of a door of the synagogue and then a man holding a gun opening the same door just seconds later before he turned around and closed it. Moments later, several shots, and then an explosion could be heard. I mean, for my money and to my mind, a successful mission is freeing the hostages and capturing the suspect. That's, to me, a successful mission for something like this, and yet they're celebrating the fact that they executed him. It's like the bar is so low. Because then you become the terrorist. The feds become the terrorist. Because they've just gone and killed somebody who hasn't killed anyone else. If he'd have killed a bunch of people, then fine, it's like, okay, take him out. But he hadn't killed anybody. So don't kill him. Put him on trial. Chris has joined us from Illinois. We have Alexis, and Christopher, and Sejal, and Rain, and Jonathan, Kobe, Lee, and Freddie, of course. Thank you so much for being with Backchannel on this Martin Luther King Jr. Day. It's 10:30, the 17th of January, 2022. I'm Anthony Davis. This is the Anthony Davis Show. And we've got, we've been discussing, kind of quite a lot today, and we've been weaving in the conversation about Martin Luther King and civil rights. And I do want to talk about that a little bit more now. The Voting Rights Act, 1965, August 6. President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law, calling the day a triumph for freedom, as huge as any victory that has ever been won on any battlefield. The law came 7 months after Martin Luther King launched a Southern Christian Leadership Conference based in Selma, Alabama, with the aim of pressuring Congress to pass such legislation. In Selma, King wrote, "We see a classic pattern of disenfranchisement typical of the southern Black Belt areas, where Negroes are in the majority. In addition to facing arbitrary literacy tests and poll taxes, African Americans in Selma and other southern towns were intimidated, harassed, and assaulted when they sought to register to vote. Civil rights activists met with fierce resistance to the campaign, which attracted national attention on the 7th of March 1965, when civil rights workers were brutally attacked by white law enforcement officers on a march from Selma to Montgomery." So Johnson introduced the Voting Rights Act that same month, with the outrage of Selma still fresh. In just over 4 months, Congress passed the bill. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 abolished literacy tests and poll taxes designed to disenfranchise African-American voters, and gave the federal government the authority to take over voter registration in counties with a pattern of persistent discrimination. Carla, do you know what they used to do with this, how they used to discriminate? They would ask people of color to guess how many balls were in a jar. Do you know about this? The ball jar guessing game. And if you got close to count, it was a bit like, it's the type of thing you would see at a fairground or something. They would literally prevent people from voting if they incorrectly guessed the correct number of balls in a jar. Marbles or whatever. Of course, it's an impossible task. And this is what would happen. This was one of the scams that was used to prevent black people from voting. And there were various mechanisms in place that they used to control the vote. Johnson introduced the Voting Rights Act the same month, with the outrage of Selma still fresh. In just over 4 months, Congress passed the bill. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 abolished literacy tests. This law covers many pages, Johnson said before signing the bill, but the heart of the act is plain. Wherever, by clear and objective standards, states and counties are using regulations or laws or tests to deny the right to vote. See what it was? It was a test. If you want to vote, you've got to pass the test. How many balls in the jar? Then they will be struck down, said Johnson. On the same day Johnson signed the bill, he announced that his Attorney General would initiate lawsuits against 4 states that still required a poll tax to register, although King called the law a great step forward in removing all of the remaining obstacles to the right to vote. He knew that the ballot would only be effective as an effective tool for social change if potential voters rid themselves of the fear associated with voting. And to meet this goal, and rid the American body politic of racism, they developed the Political Education and Voter Registration Department. So on this day, we recognize how civil rights in America have evolved. But I also think it's essential that we recognize that it has also taken a terrible turn, and how the far right and the cult, this new cult of Trump, to quote the title of the book by Stephen Hassan, has kind of taken hold, and now instead of civil rights, we have civil war. It's a war of words in most cases, apart from January 6th when we saw it was a war of fists and sticks and swords and whatever else they could lay their hands on. And guns, of course. So what would Martin Luther King make of today's voting rights situation? Do you think he would be devastated at how things have taken a turn for the worse? There are still a few people of that era that are still campaigning. Of course, John Lewis died last year, but there are still people that were intrinsically linked to that civil rights movement who are still banging the drum, not least the eldest son of Martin Luther King, who today references his father. And he says, "This is for you, Dad," and posted an image of them marching over the bridge. Just 8 days after Martin Luther King Jr. led a peaceful civil rights march in Selma, Alabama, President Lyndon Johnson announced his intention to pass the Federal Voting Rights Act to ensure that no federal, state, or local government could in any way impede people from voting because of their race or ethnicity. He signed the Voting Rights Act into law that year, banning racial discriminatory practices in voting, including literacy tests. And yet here we are, all these years later, where people like Stacey Abrams are having to stand up for these rights that should have been considered normal, that should have become part of the fabric of civility and society, and yet it seems to have all been undone. Now that, white Republicans have been able to rig the elections in many cases. The most recent attempt to strengthen the right to vote is the John Lewis Voting Rights Amendment Act, or Advancement Act. Introduced in Congress in early 2019, the proposed bill was renamed following the passing of the civil rights activist and longtime House of Representatives member John Lewis. Redistricting, poll location changes and closures, limiting access to convenient early voting. These are all in current attempts to disenfranchise black voters. Now, of course, the Republicans who are attempting this will deny that. And they are doing all of this in the face of what they claim is increased election security. But of course, there was no fraud in 2020. It's been proven that there was no fraud. And so they're effectively bringing about these changes despite the fact that there was no reason to in the first place. And by doing it at a state level with these state legislatures and putting in these Trump sympathetic individuals, they are effectively changing the law from within, like by stealth. So, where do we go now? Where do we go now? How do we ensure that future generations are entitled to vote in a respectful and even way right across America, where it isn't different in every state? Because as I mentioned, Kentucky is increasingly difficult to vote in. And this is, there is audio tape of Trump trying to find 11,000 more votes in Georgia, a state that he lost. I mean, they're not even hiding it. This type of thing is now being done in plain sight. The family of Martin Luther King Jr. and their supporters, some shouting, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, voter suppression has to go," they marched on Washington today, urging a passage of law to protect voters from racial discrimination. As part of the annual Martin Luther King Day Jr. DC Peace Walk, the King family and more than 100 national and local civil rights groups strode across Frederick Douglass Memorial Bridge, calling on Joe Biden's Democrats to pass a bill in the U.S. Senate. The march followed a disappointing week for Joe Biden, who went to the Capitol to urge Senate colleagues to change the chamber's rules so they would overcome Republican opposition to the bill, only to be forcefully rejected by two conservative Democrats who hold effective veto power. In a separate speech live-streamed to the late Reverend King's Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Vice President Kamala Harris also urged the Senate to act, warning that efforts to restrict voting in some U.S. states could make it more difficult for millions of Americans to vote. The Senate must pass this bill now, she said. Today, we must not be complacent or complicit. I mean, this is what I don't understand about this administration. Making speeches is not enough anymore. It used to have some impact. It used to be the case that you could make some empowering speech and it compelled people to look within. But, the rules of the game are over. The rules have changed now. The Republicans have no interest in democracy. They care only for power. And this is what I want to make absolutely clear, is that Democrats want voting rights so that everybody can vote, including Republicans. You know, that they want free access to the vote because they fundamentally believe in democracy. They fundamentally believe that if a Republican wins the presidency, they will step aside. They will support the handover. They will respect the result of the vote. Because they believe fundamentally in democracy, as I did. When Donald Trump was elected, I was like, fine, show me what you can do. You know, the people have chosen you. He didn't claim any fraud then. He did leading up to the election. He did start sowing the seeds back in 2016 that if he loses, it'll be because of fraud. And then, of course, he won, so he didn't say any more about fraud after the election. He was very willing to accept that he won fairly and squarely. But then, of course, as his poll numbers were falling as he was approaching the 2020 election, 2 years out, that's when he started sowing the seeds about fraud again and effectively saying that if he didn't win, it's because the election was fraudulent. And then, of course, he didn't win, and the election was proven to not be fraudulent. So, what are we dealing with here? It's just endless and relentless. Well, I don't know. I mean, Carla's asking if I think the Americans should change the voting rights age. I don't think that's a priority right now because it's not going to make any difference. You know, the priority should be everybody having access to the vote and not restricting voting. The voting age is, you know, that's something you can only do once you've actually got the right to vote generally. But currently, as it stands, it's not really possible. At a rally before Monday's march, King's son, Martin Luther King III, praised Democrats for passing a sweeping infrastructure bill last year, but implored them to push through voting rights legislation. He said, "You were successful with infrastructure, which is a great thing. But we need you to use that same energy to ensure that all Americans have the unencumbered right to vote." King, his wife, Andrea Waters King, and their daughters, Yolanda Renee King, led the march across the bridge. "We need to make sure that everyone in this country can get to the polls, vote, and have their vote heard." The bill before the Senate would expand access to mail-in voting, strengthen federal oversight of elections in states with a history of racial discrimination, and tighten campaign finance rules. Democratic supporters say it is needed to counter a wave of new restrictions on voting passed in Republican-led states that election observers say would make it harder for minority and low-income voters to cast ballots. New restrictions have emerged following former President Donald Trump's false claims that his 2020 election defeat was the result of widespread fraud. The top Senate Democrat Chuck Schumer said the chamber would take up the bill on Tuesday, a delay from his earlier plan to hold a procedural vote on the bill by today, the federal holiday, honoring Martin Luther King Jr. Republicans who hold half the 100 seats in the Senate are united in opposition to the bill, which they brand as a partisan power grab. That leaves Joe Biden and Schumer with just one path to passing it, persuading conservative Democratic senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema to agree to change the chamber's filibuster rule that requires at least 60 senators to agree on most legislation. King told the press that he believed history would judge Sinema and Manchin harshly. He cited the proliferation of laws to restrict ballot access in Republican-controlled states. Well, I actually tweeted something about this morning. I said, "I'm ready for Biden to humiliate Manchin and Sinema, to explain to the people where their allegiance lies, name their big Republican donors, expose how they are compromised, talk about their finances versus the poverty in their states, take the gloves off." Because, you know, nothing else seems to have worked. And humiliation now seems to be like the only way to really bring this forward. Some civil rights groups in Georgia that helped propel Biden to presidential victory during the 2020 election boycotted his voting rights speech in Atlanta last week, saying they were disappointed by Biden's lack of action. Black voters risked everything, including their own health at the height of the pandemic, to vote for Biden and state Democrats, said Cliff Albright, co-founder of Voters Matter. It's time that officials in Washington treat us and our rights with the same level of urgency. Should these groups lose their enthusiasm for Democrats, it could increase the party's chances of losing their razor-thin majorities in at least one chamber of Congress in the election of November 8 this year. Yolanda Townsend, who called herself a senior from the Washington, D.C. area, said at the rally with King III that she found Biden's Georgia speech timely and forceful. I wish it was drawn earlier, but I think a line in the sand has been drawn, and you're either with us or against us. I mean, my concern now is that he's given the Republicans a year to rig the election at a state level. And he's given the Democrats less than a year, 9 months, to pass voting rights. You know, by doing infrastructure first, he's effectively delayed this entire 2-year period that was needed in full. He should have done voting rights first. I really hope that they can come up with some very clever way of making this work, you know, by looking at some old case law or former legislation, or dig something up, you know, like Schumer did the other day, by way of getting people to debate in the Senate. Many extraordinary women, and often unsung heroes, played significant roles in the civil rights movement and beyond. So I thought maybe we would take a little look at some of the females that have been prominent. We mentioned, of course, the one that managed to make Martin Luther King Jr. a public holiday. But beyond that, let's look at Ella Baker, who died in 1986. She was a highly respected civil rights leader who mostly worked behind the scenes, advising, supporting, and mentoring greats like W.E.B. Du Bois, Thurgood Marshall, Martin Luther King Jr., and Rosa Parks. Baker's reputation as a leader and movement builder earned her the nickname Fundi, which is Swahili for a person who teaches craft to the next generation. And then there was Daisy Bates, who died in 1999. She was a newspaper publisher who documented the fight to end segregation and discrimination in Arkansas. She became president of the Arkansas chapter of the NAACP and played a crucial role in desegregation, fighting for desegregated public schools. She was the guiding force behind enrolling 9 black students in an all-white school in Little Rock, famously known as the Little Rock Nine. Her relentless efforts to promote and enforce education equality are regarded as major contributions to the civil rights movement. And then there was Fannie Lou Hamer, who died in 1977, who led a life dedicated to fighting racial injustice and promoting the African American vote and voice in politics. She co-founded the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in 1964. She ran for Congress in Mississippi in 1965. And while her bid for Congress may have been unsuccessful, Hamer's legacy of political activism during the civil rights movement will never be forgotten. She spent her life focused on improving the opportunities of African American women. She was a key organizer of the 1963 March on Washington, working with some of the major civil rights activists, including Martin Luther King Jr. In 1971, she helped to found the National Women's Political Caucus. Acknowledging Haight's contributions to the civil rights movement and to women's rights, former President Bill Clinton awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1994. She died in 2010. Diane Nash is still alive. She was a member of the influential Freedom Riders and one of the most prominent student leaders of the civil rights movement. Not only did she help found the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, she also led the Selma voting rights movement. A fearless advocate, Diane Nash is an incredible example of the power of students to create change. And finally, let's look at Joanne Robinson, who died in 1992. They say many recognize the historic 1955 Montgomery bus boycott as one of the most important events of the civil rights movement. Few realize, however, that Joanne Robinson was the woman who started it all. Following the arrest of Rosa Parks, Robinson distributed over 50,000 flyers, calling on African Americans to boycott city buses on December 5th, 1955. Joanne's sense of justice and belief in nonviolent protest propelled the civil rights movement forward and changed the course of history. So there it is. That's kind of our tribute to Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And I hope you are commemorating and celebrating in equal measure. And with it, you will find it in yourselves to go looking and searching and reading to find out what's happening to the state of modern democracy, civil rights, human rights, and voting rights. Maybe you'll go to the website of the NAACP, which is naacp.org, where there's a section on knowing the issues, how to take action, finding resources. Very important. That's naacp.org. And I also feel like, we really get one chance in, this world, don't we, to kind of do something, to be active or activated or an activist. And I don't remember in my lifetime it being more troubling than it is now. Obviously we have this big climate change thing overhead. Davey, good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for joining us from Texas. But then on the actual Earth itself, if there's not volcanoes going off causing these huge tsunamis in Tonga, where you get a warning in Santa Monica that there might be a tsunami. I mean, the planet is telling us something right now. But so are the activists, and so are the people who crave equality. It's not seeking to make Democrats favorable in the vote. It's just seeking equality in the vote. That's all that they crave. So with that, I bid you a very good day. Thank you for joining Backchannel, and I will see you tomorrow at 9 a.m. Pacific. Happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day.
Yo, what is up?
Not much. Nothing in there. Boom. Great. And
Okay, here I am. Sorry, just turning on the cans.
turn on the cans.
Hey, quick question for you.
Yeah.
Uh, do you think it'd be possible
Maybe.
to get our the latest Binge Boys episode up by Wednesday?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great, great. We want to start, and I know you were out of town and everything. And please let me know if there's anything else we can do. But we would love to just get it up a little bit earlier, because if it goes up like Friday or the weekend, that's a tougher time to get people to listen. Ideally, Wednesday or Thursday,
Okay,
will
sure.
just like yield more listeners. Thanks, man. And again, like, let us know if there's anything we can do.
No, it's should be fine. I actually was meaning to check if we had, and I guess if there's any, if there is one thing, when you upload, this is not a requirement, but it doesn't
Yeah.
let me know when something's uploaded.
Oh, gotcha. So, message you.
Yeah, just shoot me a text, be like, hey, there's an episode in there.
Gotcha. Let me run and refill my coffee here and fix the green screen, and then we'll fire it up. Yep.
Yeah, sounds good.
Thanks, Travis.
Hooray!
All right. Shall we?
We shall. It's far away.
Dive into the void. What's that icon in the lower?
That, I think, is coming through on your end. It says like a Logitech. It says Logi, but it's backwards.
Oh.
I think. I don't have anything. Yeah. There we go.
All right. Let me just make it so it doesn't.
Yeah. All right.
All right. Let's do it.
Let's do it. Countdown.